re-intro here.
And did you mention, or you're about to mention that you wrote this thing in PowerShell that you're using for the presentation?
Yes, this presentation is PowerShell. I am a very good yak shaver, so I got distracted and spent time building that instead of working on content. Hopefully there's a little bit of content too. Yeah, so this is called From Intimidation to Interaction. It's my personal journey through adopting PowerShell. I've been in the IT industry for 14 years, and I've been exposed to PowerShell for the entire time, but only in the last couple of years have I really started getting into it heavily. These are my efforts that I'm trying to make to help other people not take so long to get into it, because I wasted my time with a lot of bash, but that's another story. Broken it up into 3 sections. We've got intimidation, interaction, and challenges. During intimidation, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I found as someone dropping into PowerShell from other programming disciplines, and the things that I'm doing to avoid that being intimidating for others. In the interaction section, I'm going to talk a bit about the experimental stuff I'm dealing with, things like the chat GPTs, PowerShell AI, and some other things. And then the third section here, challenges. Some of the stuff I still struggle with. I've only really dumped into this in the last 2 years heavily, so there's a lot of things I don't know. G'day, Steve. Someone just entered the room to give me moral support. So is it intimidating? A lot of people have said no. But I think a lot of people forget how much experience they actually have. So when you're dropping in as a junior, someone like me, I'd spent 10 years prior to this just playing games on a Macintosh computer. So when someone threw me some PowerShell, absolutely nothing made sense, because you're not just dealing with a new language, you're dealing with a whole new ecosystem. And PowerShell back in those days tended to be associated with very complicated enterprise technology. So do you remember the first time you're thrown in the deep end? I certainly do. It was at the New Zealand Police, and they had a lot of old technology. We're dealing with a lot of Windows XP, and everything was new to me. Someone's first steps into PowerShell can be pretty overwhelming, and these are some of the things that I'm trying to do to make them less overwhelming for others. So if I went to continue now, that's where I'm at today. But if we start a new career, we'll see where I was at 10 years ago, dealing with the things that I was struggling with. Oh, g'day, this is my old boss. He looks a lot like Professor Oak from Pokemon. It's just a coincidence. And he's saying, hello there, welcome to the world of PowerShell. My name is Generic Experienced IT Wizard. I was 23, so everyone seemed like an older wizard to me. People call me the PowerShell prof. This world is inhabited by creatures called computers. For some people, computers are pets. Others use them for fights. Myself, I study computers as a profession. That's just straight quoting from Pokemon. There's not even anything relevant for you today. So your name is Shaun, and this is your new teammate. He's the 10x engineer. You might think, no, those are mythical. There's none of those around. But when you're a junior, everyone is a 10x, 100x, 1000x engineer. You know nothing, and everyone else seems to know the answer to every single question you've ever got. Shaun, your very own PowerShell legend is about to unfold. A world of dreams and adventures with PowerShell awaits. Let's go. So for those who thought that this might drop into the actual Pokemon game, I'm sorry. I actually had to present, so this is straight into the content.
Hey, I just wanted to say that your point about 10x engineers, when I started in the industry, it was on the mainframe, but basically you didn't know the answer unless Ted was in the room, because Ted was like the expert. He was in the business already 30 years. So I hear you, and I remember those days. They were highly intimidating. Go ahead.
Always is. So we've got our first bit of a task from Generic Experienced IT Wizard. Hi, Shaun. We've received an alert for a server running low on disk space. I might have skipped a few chapters because they wouldn't throw me at a server straight away. You can use the cleanup script, cleanupscript.ps1 on the shared drive to clear some space out. Run the script in a PowerShell terminal. Good luck. So this is kind of my first entry point to PowerShell, was running other people's scripts. And most of them went along the lines of this. So confidently finding the script, entering a terminal, slapping enter, seeing some red text and not knowing what it means. Script keeps going. You've had no chance to react. You haven't even been taught what Control C is yet, so you don't know how to stop this thing. It's just running away and deleting my entire presentation. We're just gonna have to wait for it to remove all the photos. And now our log cleanup is complete. What actually happened? It couldn't change into the logs directory because it didn't exist. but then it proceeded to delete everything it found anyway. It seems simple. They gave me an easy script to start with. It's just a 3-liner. Go into the logs directly, remove all of the child items, and then go for it. So get child item being find all of the files in here. Recurse being just go through and find them in every folder inside this folder as well. Some of you might be saying this is a terrible script, Shaun. You shouldn't be running this, but I've run into a lot of terrible scripts in my time, and I've written a few myself. Some of this stuff makes assumptions, like set location logs. You can't really make these assumptions when you're expecting juniors to be picking things up. So what do I do instead? I try not to make them think about error action preferences. I've had an argument about this with people before. They think, well, it's my preference. I should be in control of when the errors are handled and how they're handled. But my preference is for me to do that in my script because I'm the one who knows the impact of if an error occurs and what can follow on from it. I don't know if this is terrible practice, but it's an opinion, so take with it what you will. So for here, I've just set the error action preference to stop so that next time this runs, if it can't change directories, it's going to bomb out. I've run into this so many times recently, setting up Kubernetes nodes on Windows with the official PowerShell scripts. It mistakenly got the wrong IP address and then started throwing errors halfway through and then destroyed all of the configs on the machine. So it's not just things that happened back in the day. This thing happens all the time. There's a link here as well. I'm using the Valve cleanup algorithm, which they had a problem with where they accidentally, mistakenly got an empty variable and deleted all the files on your computer. On to our next task. So, hi Shaun, this 10x engineer is working on some of our interview questions. Can you provide some feedback? Should be easy enough to read. I can't read under the admit prompt. Shaun Wheeler's trying to get in. There we go. It should be easy enough to read. If you need a hand, reach out. Check out FizzBuzz condensed on the shared drive. Okay, I'm on it. And this looks complicated. You're probably thinking, well, that's just over-engineered. But you're a junior. Everything literally looks like this. You've got pipes on pipes. You've got $ underscores. You've got question marks all over the place. You've got % signs. You just don't know what anything's going on. Part of me wonders if this even works. So when I'm talking about scripting for other people to adopt, obviously your audience matters. Sometimes this is okay. If it's in your own terminal, go for it. But I generally try to avoid those and stick with things like this. So we give for each object and it's great. But if you're building PowerShell for someone's build script and they're a C# developer, they don't want to see something new every time they look in there. So for something like this, using a standard for loop, standard if statements, you're avoiding having that extra cognitive overhead when someone's trying to figure out what your stuff is doing. Even for yourself, sometimes it can be easy to read. Definitely personal preference, but this is how the way I operate. And just for shits and giggles, we will check out what this does. So if we look at this FizzBuzz, do we really know what's going on? We got this 1, 2 ellipses and 100. For some of you, you'll realize that's a range operator. It's saying generate me an array of numbers from 1 to 100. We've got this pipe into a % sign. That's going to be something like for each object, but we were saving some space because we like to type fast. And then we've got this weird concoction. So we've got $X, that variable, equals fizz times something or other. Let's break this apart. So we've got $X and we're appending to $X. So same thing again. Now we've got something a little easier to read. We've also got a semicolon in here, so we can put that one on a new line. And then we've got this weird question mark, which some of you will know is a ternary. So if we were to rephrase that, that would look something like if $X, if it exists, and otherwise we have an alternative branch. So what do we got? If it exists, we just return it. And if it doesn't, we return the other one, $_ which for us is the magic variable, meaning the current number in that array. Again, for each object, great. And hopefully this thing does something. You can see it's generated a bunch of fizz buzzes. I'm not going to run that through some unit tests. It's close enough. It generated a few fizzes, a few buzzes, and some numbers. So that one's good. And if we take that to the next step, I Really do love some of the constructs, but I found I was using them a lot in my earlier days and confusing other people. So I'd be using those percent signs and I'd be using the $ underscore all the place through my scripts. And I was really bad at abstracting into functions. So when someone's reading it, they'd get halfway down and see one of these magic variables and not know whether it's referring to the block above or the block to the left or the block 15 lines up. So for me, again, because I'm dealing with a lot of developers outside of PowerShell, I usually write a lot of this stuff now using more standard constructs. Like we've got the for each folder and folders here. So we're giving variables sensible names while we're operating with them. We're using the full names of commands rather than making assumptions like ls, because a lot of people have used bash before. And when they see ls or they see curl, they think, cool, I know what I'm doing now. And it's dangerous because those are just aliases to PowerShell functions. They don't have all the same functionality they're expecting. Now we're on to our next one, generic. G'day, mate. Hey, Shaun, we need to check out the trigger build script's doing. It kicks off a nightly project build for some of the older apps. It was working until someone upgraded the build server. I'm like, yeah, okay, we'll get onto this. This looks like another one of my scripts. There's a few lines, absolutely no error handling, and also no context. So when we run this, we're going to get a bad request. And I was helping someone on my team with this recently because we have a lot of integrations between build servers and some of them send terrible payloads to the others, and this is all you get. And at the end of that, you've failed something in a 3-hour pipeline and you've provided no details for someone to debug it in the future. So what do? Pretty standard. You just write a bit of logging. Sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry with these things. So for me, generally, if I'm doing requests to API endpoints, I will log the payloads. Obviously, you need to be careful if it's sensitive, but for most things you can. So if we have a look at what's going on here, we'll get a bit more details. I just logged it verbose. So now we've got sending this post request and we can take a guess at what's happened. This doesn't look like valid JSON. So you may have noticed there's no warning here to say the JSON's been truncated because someone turned that off. So if we do the same thing again, we'll have a look. Get our projects. What are we looking at? Okay, we've got 3 properties on there. We've got name, ID, and settings. So we go into the settings. What's that look like? What was it? V2. We've got default and we've got a couple of architectures. So there's actually some nested. I can't type and talk at the same time. Sorry, I just realized.
And I'm going to interrupt you because so you built this whole thing that we're looking at is a PowerShell script that actually helps, that's letting you do the presentation. And at the same time, you built it that it has an embedded PowerShell prompt.
Yep. It's just running PowerShell again inside itself.
Awesome.
There's a few times I might get lost in how many nested PowerShells deep I am. And if I do, you're gonna have to wait for me to dig my way out.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we've just hit the endpoint. We've kind of discovered what the shape of the object looks like. So if we think, okay, well, what we're doing is converting it to JSON, right? It looks fine to me. Oh, but we're embedding it inside another object. So we've got a $ payload here. That's something we're putting inside. So let's try that. It was projects equals projects. Now we get it. So the truncation of JSON is actually burning us here. If we look at the payload now, it's going to have that same object in the middle, and we've debugged what's happened. But having the logging has allowed us to start the debugging process halfway through. So if this was a much longer script, we'd have enough information to go on to identify the area where we need to look. So that's why I generally try to do that nowadays. And if we were to do that again, I don't know why the default depth is 2. I pretty much put 10 on everything these days. So perfect. Now we've got a payload that makes sense. We can try fire it through and see if we get there. Got to keep scrolling up again. I already called it payload JSON. And our result has succeeded. So we've got a build triggered now. So we're good to go. But this would have been a whole lot longer if we'd had a long script and we didn't have any debugging along the way. I think there are also some frameworks for PowerShell to do logging to files. So you can do append content or whatever. In this case, I've just written verbose. We use Octopus server a lot, which is a build deployment server built by a company in Australia. And their one, if you write verbose in your PowerShell scripts, it actually gets all of that logged on the build server at a verbose level as well. So that's really handy for us. We've solved this problem. On to the next one. We just keep getting easier and easier over time, which is good. But there's been a lot of frustrating endpoints where this is over the course of 8 years for me. I kept digging in and then having something fail and then getting frustrated with PowerShell and leaving. So this is our 10x engineer. They're off to lunch. Need you to update some app pool configs on a dev server. So we're going to change some IIS settings for the web server. Use disable idle timeout. It's in the shared docs on my PC. No one here is using source control because this is still 8 years ago. And even with, I went back too far. Even with Visual Source Safe, no one was still using it. So I just have to jump back to my previous slide because I skipped ahead. So what are we doing? We're grabbing an app pool here. We're importing a module web administration. And then we're going through the app pools to find one that has our app pool name. And then we are setting the idle timeout. So for those who haven't used IIS much, the idle timeout is how long it'll wait before it goes to sleep. The next time you hit the website, it has to warm back up again. And sometimes it can take a very long time depending on how poor your application programming is. We used to do a set item, so then we're actually updating the config, and then we're writing it to the host that we've disabled the idle timeout. I put this in here because it's relevant for what I'm talking about at the moment. I'm just going to drop in the version of PowerShell we're using as well. So for this, cool. Object not found, drive not found, and also there's some kind of runtime exception. It's also not logged the name of the app pool, so we know it's failed pretty poorly, and it's told us it was running from PowerShell version 7. And for those of you who are familiar with this stuff, the difference in PowerShell versions can mean a lot or a little depending on your application and depending on what environment you're in. For us here dealing with IIS, a lot of this stuff works better under PowerShell 5. Things like this magic drive here, IIS / just out of the box doesn't work super easily, even though we force imported this web administration module. So my solution for this is a bit of a hack, but it's one I've been pretty happy with. I've got something here called Enter Windows PowerShell. So we're still in PowerShell 7 now because that's where I'm doing my presentation, but it's able to go through and take the same script and at this point, recognize that it's in PowerShell 7, stop processing, and continue the rest of it in the PowerShell version that I chose, which for me was Windows PowerShell because I wanted the stuff that was available there. So if we run this, hopefully it'll work. And it takes a wee bit because it's switched PowerShell versions, but we're able to set the idle timeout now from PowerShell 5. So a bit magic, probably not magic for some people, but for others, I found this useful and I'd never really thought about it until it ran into it one time with, we have a lot of developers here who use different versions of PowerShell. And after about the 100th time of selling someone, no, use the blue PowerShell, not the dark blue one. I came up with this solution. And then further down the line, I started to run into the problem of people running stuff from Windows subsystem for Linux. And then there were some finicky bits there which caused problems as well. So this solution was built for both. Enter Windows PowerShell, if we just dig through what's happening, it's checking what version we are. If it's greater than 5, because that was basically what I was after, it's trying to work out the name of the script. So it's using this magic variable here, PS command path, to work out what script you are currently running. It's also replacing the Unix file path, the mount C, with the Windows drive letter format. And then it is going through all the parameters you passed in so you don't lose them when the second execution, and generates a new set of parameters as a string. Probably a better way to do that. It's just writing here in verbose that it's relaunching in PowerShell for Windows, and then it uses start process to start the new process. So we're just rerunning the script, but with these two flags, no new window and wait, we can execute it inside the terminal that we're working in. So it's going to run PowerShell, and all of the output that was originally coming from that script is going to come back to the user as if they were in the correct one all along. So this works on Windows subsystem for Linux as well. A few of these flags, I don't know why I put them there. Use new environment. I use this a lot on dev machines, so I probably added new environment variables and didn't want them to have to open a new terminal. At this point, it hits exit 0, and it successfully leaves the execution. So it's a bit weird. But that whole enter PowerShell thing is going to actually hit that first line in PowerShell 7. And because it entered this if block, it's going to exit at that point as soon as it has actually forked off to PowerShell 5 to get the answers. A little bit bonkers, but I've found it really useful. I don't know if you can wrap your head around it. It's really handy to have. Another advantage to this as well is you can actually do, not enter Windows PowerShell, but this start process takes an extra flag. Start process, I think the verb, run as. So this will actually run it as an administrator. There was no prompt there because I'm already running my current terminal as an admin at the moment. But you can use this to elevate as well. So if you're running a script that requires administrative privileges, it can fork off to a new process with the admin privileges and then return the results. So there's lots of ways you can use start process to work around some weird environmental issues. This here for me, I struggled a lot in the beginning when there was only like one version of PowerShell, but I was running it in the wrong place or on the wrong operating system. Nowadays, we've got Windows Subsystem for Linux. We've got PowerShell Core. We've got PowerShell 5. I don't know if anyone's still running Monad, but it might be out there. So I found this solution to be quite a good one for me. We will jump on to the next. Nice work on the app calls. I knew you'd find a way. Here's another one for you. I have a run book for setting up new Windows GitHub runners. See if you can fire one up. Now, I'm getting pretty burnt out at this stage. All I keep doing is running the stuff that's broken, and I'm not expecting this one to go well either. So how hard could it be? They've given me 32 chapters on Confluence. So we're going to try and follow their instructions. I'm going to skip over Connect AZ account because I know I'm already logged in. We're going to hit line 1. Just load the latest template with this. Okay, cool. I've got a template YAML, and we're going to convert it from YAML into an object. Seems reasonable. And now we get it. But we don't have it installed. This happens a lot as well, the assumption around modules. And there is a solution to this. We're going to just quickly rip through one. So instead of running this as a Confluence page of instructions, almost always, if you've written a page of instructions, you can write it as a script, but we're going to just rewrite this. So if we jump in and just write a little test.ps1 file, might already have one existing there. I've got test2. We're going to try and work around this. So we don't have convert from YAML available. We're just going to stub out what we're doing with a hello. Just if it runs hello, we know we've met the requirements. And then we've got a requires statement. So requires is useful for versions of PowerShell. You could say version 5, version 7. I could have used that previously when I was talking about switching Windows versions itself. But they have the same kind of problem for a new user. And that's that the writing that comes out of it is a little bit obscure. So requires modules. I think this one that I want is called PowerShell YAML. And then write host hello. So it's going to make the assumption that we need to have that thing installed. So now if we run that, okay, cool. The script test cannot be run because the following modules that are specified by the requires statement are missing. And this is great, but I don't know if you've noticed this, but there seems to be something when anyone, including myself, sees red text on a terminal, they immediately forget how to read. I look at it and I go, oh shit, I need to call Doug. Something's gone wrong. Don't even like stack trace. It's just hieroglyphs. There's nothing going on, nothing that makes sense. So I try and avoid these situations. Although it's built into the language, I think it'd be nice if there was a more human-friendly way or maybe suggestions for this. So rather than that, I generally jump in and do something along the lines of, I could probably use get module or just use get command, convert from YAML. I do this with native commands as well if someone doesn't have things like the AWS command line installed. So if C doesn't exist, we're going to write them a friendly message. Warning seems to be less aggressive than red, so we'll go with that. You need to install PowerShell YAML module with install module, please. Can't spell, but that's okay. And then we're probably going to want to exit rather than throw an error. All right, so this time around, oops, I left the required statement in there. Let's just get rid of that one. If I don't get lost in my nested terminals, I might get lost in Vim. I'm just trying to learn how to use it. Oh, we got more errors. So don't want to confuse people with this type of thing. Having extra errors pop in is not very user-friendly, even though it's working as designed. So let's just make this one be quiet. It's quite nerve-wracking typing in front of people on a keyboard that I don't generally do my work on. Okay, cool. So now we've got a language that's slightly more user-friendly. Hey, you need to install PowerShell YAML module with install module, please. And going forwards, I've got a thing in the experiment section I think would help with this type of thing, but I'll get to that when I get to it. I'm not going to talk about it now. This here is still significantly better, I think, than what we could previously be dealing with. And this Confluence article could have been written as a PowerShell script and handled a lot of this for us. All right. Finding commands and assuming people have things installed on their computers is painful. We've got someone else who's dropped in. We've got a developer this time. Hey, Shaun, I'm having trouble with one of the scripts your team built. It's supposed to show me my file checksums. Sounds like a pretty dumb script. It's not finding anything on my machine, but it works on other people's. As is true in IT support, I'm going to ask them to turn it off and turn it on again. Yeah, that works, and then it breaks again. So it's an intermittent issue with a probably pretty complicated script. I guess I'll take a look, dust off my PowerShell gloves and see what's going on. And for the uninitiated, this might just look like a normal function. You've done nothing wrong. You opened it in the PowerShell editor. There were no red squiggles. You're good to go. So let's run it and see why. Get file hashes. Okay, it returns nothing. Okay, we'll just start executing it line by line to see where we get to. So we've got some files. Do we have any files? Yeah, we've got 205 of them, so it should be finding something there. We're initializing a new empty array called output. And then we're looping through each of the files in the files list. If processed is greater than limit, we break out. We haven't set processed, so it can't be that. And at the end, we're incrementing it. So I can't see how this would cause any problems. But after a bit of digging, you realize that there's a variable we can set in another script on the command line, which is actually interfering. And out of the box, PowerShell is not very strict about this. It's great because it's very, very flexible, but this burns me very frequently. And recently I've run into it again with a loop for a build where it was checking some things and setting a variable and it never initialized it. So on the second run, it would be failing the second time. How do we avoid this? Well, we can just wipe that variable out so we can run the script and check if it works. And yeah, it does. But coming from other languages, you don't kind of expect that to bleed into this function. You think this little block here is dealing with its own little view of the world, but it's not. The variable's everywhere, and they're waiting to bite you at the time you don't expect. So what would you do? You would initialize this. So at the top here, you'd say processed equals null. Cool, done. Or processed equals 0. But then what happens to the one that was on the command line? If that was inside your function, wouldn't that overwrite the one that's outside? No, that's a special case. So PowerShell is a bit interesting like that. I have found that I think this is what set strict mode is for. Doug, I'm not sure if that's actually the truth, but it seems to be. That's what I've seen. With strict mode, it won't let you use these variables that way.
Yeah, I'm not a master at strict mode. Maybe somebody who's watching probably knows that better.
I'll do my little explain like on 5 of strict mode anyway. So I think there's a few extra rules, but this is one of the main ones. So if we do something like we used to, we rely on this a lot in the script. So hello user, but we haven't set user. So PowerShell kind of just flattens these things down to the default value for the object. So user doesn't even have an object type. It's just going to be null or an empty string. With strict mode though, I've got it set off. We set it to whatever the latest one is. When we do this, it actually throws an error. So there are ways around this. I don't know if strict mode is the perfect solution. I'd probably prefer this to be the behavior generally across PowerShell, but I think there are some good reasons which I'm unaware of for why it behaves this way. Definitely makes things a lot more flexible, having these variables you can rely on to be empty at some points in time. But yeah, so if you're looking at doing something and you want to try and check that your scripts are a bit more rigorously safe, you can always run set strict mode at the top of them just to make sure that you're actually doing things the way that you think you are. I ran into this writing PowerShell paint. I didn't use strict mode at the start. And then I ended up realizing I had lots of bugs where things were bleeding through. Turning on strict mode, it was painful because I had a lot of things to fix. Referencing uninitialized variables and stuff just all throughout my code. But once I did it, everything made a whole lot more sense to me as to what the actual control flow of data was. So strict mode is great. And that's what I'm using now. I'm trying to encourage it. I haven't pushed it on too many people because I'm still trying to get them to write PowerShell to start with.
Shaun just posted a link to the strict mode discussion in the chat. So, yep.
Cool, thanks,
I'm
Shaun.
lucky. I mostly write my modules for myself. And I usually use modules to avoid all that. I don't support legacy stuff.
Yeah. And that's what I used to do too, until they get out of hand and they start being used by 100 people. And then you go, whoopsies. Okay. Well, we're done with strict mode. We've figured out what the problem is and we can fix this script. So now we're on to what are we on next? Are we done with our intimidation? I'm done with all that. I'm evolving from the boy I was into the slightly older boy I am now. I've realized that there aren't 10x engineers. There are just people who'll try harder to find the answer than me. So now I realize that I have to do that too. So when someone comes to me and says, hey, what's the answer? You don't know it. You just know where to look. And I'm trying to make it easier for people to actually do this thing and adopt PowerShell. And based on what you've seen today, probably you think I might live in terminal. I actually don't. I really love clicking things. I don't even like writing Terraform. I like clicking the orange buttons in AWS and making stuff happen. And I think a lot of people are in a similar boat. So they don't think that firing up the terminal is the most exciting part of the day. Not everyone, like Doug, goes, I can't wait to hit that PowerShell button. I'm trying to make it more attractive though. So stuff like this, working on all of the visual aspects of it, is something that I've been really enjoying and trying to make people think a bit harder about why they're using Bash every day. So what do I do to encourage people to get into it? Oh, you can tell I'm older now because I'm wearing my glasses. That happens when you write enough PowerShell, you just get bad eyes. What I encourage people to take a rest. API consumption. So everything everywhere is a REST API at the moment. PowerShell back in the day was really good at XML too, so it would have been good for your SOAP stuff. But nowadays, with everything being used in JSON format, the fact that it magically turns some of that JSON into objects is just a huge boost to your ability to deal with these things. I've watched plenty of people struggle through in Bash trying to use JQ and write those JSON paths to extract values. And sometimes, like myself, I was familiar with it too. So I was like, it's okay. It's just what I do. I just struggle with JQ for a bit. But once I was shown how this thing worked and how I could just grab something from a URL, use this special function called invoke a REST method, and then I don't have to deal with any serialization or deserialization. I've got the power of .NET at my hands, whether I know it yet or not. I've got something that I can work with. So I got an object and it just hangs around and it's not a string. So I don't have to think about it like a string. I've got autocomplete. So one of the first few things I try to teach people is that there is autocomplete because a lot of people spend a long time in the terminal without realizing that. Myself, I got taught about control spacebar 2 years ago and I've been using PowerShell for nearly 10 years. And then I just questioned my existence because I'd spent so long hitting enter to dump the stuff to the command line 20 times to work out where things were. So the autocomplete, bloody brilliant. Some of the stuff like PS read line that's been improved recently, you can see here this guess at what I'm trying to do is amazing as well. Some of it you got to opt into though, so that's cool. But PS read line option, let's go list view. I've found this, I've only done it actually in the last couple of weeks because I saw someone else on a video had set their thing up like that. But it also will show you previously used commands in a way that you can kind of think, oh yeah, that's what I wanted. So when I'm thinking about what I've done before, I'm like, I did a PS read line something, and you can find all of the stuff that you did. These types of things that are available in the shell, these are some of the like first entry points I like to show. My team, if they're watching, I haven't showed them the PS read line thing, so I'm sorry, but I've only just found out about it myself. It makes everything a whole lot easier. So for this object, we've got an output object. We've got something called current condition. We can have a look at what we've got. I think it's an array because it said there was multiple of them. So we're going to just grab the first one. And then we're going to grab something like window. There we go. And I keep hitting tab because it auto completes on those properties as well. So you only need to get half of it right and then just try and use tab completion for the rest. Now this was great, but if we switch into something like bash, what's this going to be? It's going to clear my terminal. I'm switching to Windows subsystem for Linux. Please hold, caller. Oh no, I've switched networks. I might not be able to. Oh, it's still running. Let's just assume we're good. So we're going to try something in a bit of bash. Unfortunately, I've just realized that my terminal in subsystem for Linux is also PowerShell. So let's switch into let's go back in time and we'll run this command that we were looking at. So this would be the equivalent in bash. People are familiar with this, and this is just the way a lot of people are operating. So we're setting a variable here, output equal to something from curl. So we're going to curl this weather API as well. We get some output there. And now what have we got in output? If we look at what we've got, we don't have tab completion for this. There's nothing going on because output is just a string, because that's how shells used to operate. It's one of the big benefits of the object pipeline, obviously, but it's something that's kind of hard to conceptualize. When you tell someone the object pipeline is the greatest thing in the world, you kind of need a practical example to show them what it is. So something like this, where you can be like, you don't have to do what you've been doing all these years anymore. You don't have to deal with this wall of text using awk and sed and regex expressions to pull things out. There is obviously things like JQ, which I've just run, and it makes it look nicer, but you still don't have the same flexibility you'd have with an object pipeline here. And there are extensions with JQ to do that. But again, you've got to install all these applications, and you end up in like an ecosystem where your computer now has so much customization that you can only really operate on that one machine. PowerShell has all this stuff available everywhere, so it's great. If we look at what we're doing on the previous one, I think it was current condition. This is how you'd pull things out. You have to remember how to spell things. And now we've grabbed that piece of the object. And if we do it again, we can probably find the first one, and it starts to look like PowerShell, but I'm spending a lot more time actually reading, and I don't like to read. I've been reading Windows internals for about 5 years now. SSE, so cool. So those types of things I like to use as an entry point. I've got to scroll so far past this JSON. Oh, there we go. I like to use as an entry point for PowerShell for people who are unfamiliar with it. A lot of people these days are writing GitHub Actions and GitLab pipelines and whatnot. So they're being thrown into bash because that's where all the examples are when you're reading the documentation. It's getting better to show in PowerShell. I think I recently saw that PowerShell's at like 15% or probably a little bit less on technology people are using on the Stack Overflow survey from this year. So it's definitely cruising up, but shells are cruising up in general because people are using them a lot more. Things like Node.js are making this thing quite popular. All right, I've got to exit 3 different shells here. Hopefully, yep, we're back out. So we're on to our next example. How am I trying to make PowerShell more of an obvious part of people's lives at the business I'm at, Parts Trader? I'm really good at breaking machines. I've broken so many computers that ops will give me a new machine every few weeks. And when I came back after my last stint doing some contracting, I had been in a business which had some dev setup scripts. And I was really excited because I got given a laptop, I got given a dev setup script, and I thought, heck yeah, this is it. This is the day that I hit the dev setup and I can develop on the first day. And it just threw a lot of red errors, as classic PowerShell does, and then got to the end and it said it was complete, but nothing worked. So, I mean, there were a few things that worked, don't get me wrong. But it inspired me when I came back here to think about how I would actually set these things up. So with a combination of PowerShell desired state config, which we were already using, we use that to build the base machines. And then when someone gets given a development machine, the first thing they have to do, they're forced to open PowerShell because that's how they set everything up. So I'm going to show you here just a quick stubbed out version of our dev setup script and what you'd be doing, and a couple of the regrets I have from the way I did it. Like Doug said, I write it for myself, and I wrote this for myself. but then it started being used, and now we've got over 100 people here in the Wellington office, and we also have a Chicago office. There are a lot of people relying on these types of things, and I made some mistakes. One of which was switches. So you can see here, I've dropped out a bit of information for someone. I tried to make it kind of more engaging at the time, so I threw some text together. I did all of this by hand. I didn't realize there were things like Spectre console to make this thing easier. And then I've given them some basic information. So I've said, hey, you're currently developing for PartsTrader, the New Zealand platform. You've got some stuff that's currently running, and you've got a warning here on your containers. I turned dev Redis off because I wanted my battery to last the entire presentation. So I'm not going to worry about that one. But one of the regrets here is these, oops, that's not it, dev setup, is that I kind of made the assumption people would know what switches were. So when I asked someone to run dev setup Gearsy, dev setup, whatever it is called, I say, oh, can you run git setup or git config? And they come in here and they run it, and it just says, I don't know what that is. And it just runs the help again. It's actually entered a random function, so I don't know what I was doing there. But the switches became confusing for people, and I wish I'd gone with something a bit more like a wizard, something where they would just start it and it would prompt them throughout the thing, and they weren't able to accidentally go down the wrong path. But we're going to run git config now just to see what it kind of does. So these are basically mini wizards. You'd have to enter each switch to do it. There are probably about 8 of them now, but I just trimmed this down for the purposes of the demo. And it would take someone through stuff like this. So, oh, we're creating a new SSH key. Do you want to do something about it? Yes. I also asked them about everything they wanted to do, and found that a few people didn't realize that they were allowed to say yes. They just kept thinking that because I'd prompted them, something had gone wrong. Let's just make up a key name, fake key. So this one's going to get deleted. So it's asking me what it wants to run. And a lot of people would look at that and go, I mean, yeah, probably. I don't know what this actually means. Let's just go for it. No, I'm just going to go no passphrase. And it's created a key. So it said, hey, cool, do this. You want to go in and now set this up on your PartsTrader GitHub. For me, I think this is going to open my personal GitHub, and then it would say to copy paste it in. So we're good to go. Bogus key. I'm not actually going to save this because I've just showed. Oh, I didn't give you a private one. It's all good. So yeah, I'm trying to make this thing easier for people. This type of workflow was working, but I never had someone come to me and say, man, I really wish I could run the dev setup script again tomorrow. Like, I really enjoyed doing that. It's just something they had to do. We jump on now. I've exited the demo accidentally because I had a few bugs. Dev setup, it's just going to run the same thing. I'm going to try and get out of it. Hopefully I can get to the next slide. There we go. So I took the learnings from that and I thought, like, how can I make this slightly more user-friendly? So I created this script here recently for an intern I was working with, and he was really, really receptive to it. He thought it was great. It's called SSM Connect. For those of you who are not familiar with AWS, SSM is the system something manager, and it manages all your machines. It also provides a way of you connecting to them, kind of like a tunnel, without you having to deal with SSH. So it makes it a whole lot nicer. So for this one, I'd gone down the path of I'd started using Spectre console because I found that it was easier to deal with things like this with pick lists than asking people to enter text. And we do have choices in PowerShell, but a lot of people found that interface not quite as flexible, especially if you've got a lot of choices. So for this, I'm going to pick my personal profile. I'm going to pick a region. I actually default this for most people, so they never have to pick it. And then we're going to pick what type of machine we're connected to. Do we want to connect to a database? Do we want to connect to a EC2 instance? And it's asking me if I want to filter the names. I will just go for it. So we've got a few here. These lists can be paginated. So if you've got 20 machines, you can have them roll through, like I just said with the regions. You could also say, hey, do you want to start these instances? And you can give them like radio boxes, which is really cool as well. So we're going to just try connect demo server. What's going on there? And it might not. It's fired something up and it's copied my password to the clipboard, and we're good to go. So I tried to make these things a little easier. That whole workflow of doing the wizard-based flow kind of works better for me because trying to ask people to remember to provide specific command line flags for a lot of people is a bit too much mental overhead. And for trying to remember how to use get help as well. For people like us who are familiar with PowerShell, get help is fine. We know how to use it. But a lot of people expect something to come out of a script when you don't provide any parameters. So I kind of default to, if you haven't provided anything for these wizard scripts, it's going to give you either a help page or start the basic flow. This is cool. I connected to a machine. Don't really need it, so I'm just going to shut it down. Probably crash my presentation. Thank you, mate. Let's just run the one again just so I can get past it.
So is this Spectre console that you're working with? Is that like, can I use that in my PowerShell stuff, or is it custom?
Yes, you can. I don't want to start it. Cool. Yeah, so I have written a module for Spectre console because using Spectre console directly is possible, but it's a little bit verbose. So for things like this, where I had what was it? Read Spectre multi-selection, something like that. You provide a list of choices. Doug, not very good at typing. Shaun, PowerShell, something like a title. Pick your weapon. I think something like that is going to pop up. So this kind of abstracts away the complexity of using Spectre console directly. I just get to pick these things. Yep, it's on the gallery. I think it's called PowerShell Spectre console. Yeah, I'm going to link my GitHub at the end as well, because a few of these things, this PowerShell Spectre console, I wrote it and released it a month ago or so, and I've just been kind of experimenting because I didn't know what would be useful and what wouldn't be. Spectre console is huge. It has a lot of functionality. And by doing this presentation, I've actually learned a lot about the types of things I would want. Things like being able to write text. So I didn't realize just how much Spectre console would do for you. It has a lot of functionality, like Doug is, let's go with blue. Cool. Give you a little compliment. I put spaces around every whoopsies. So it uses stuff like, I think it's called BB code-ish, like bulletin board style formatting. So we can say Doug is cool, but we can also do a lot of stuff. So like blue on yellow. And we don't have to dance around doing right host format, foreground, background. And if we want to do some really stupid stuff, we can do things like gold, underline, blank. Oop, can't find gold. Let's just go yellow. Can't remember all of the names myself. So you can see that Doug is cool is actually flashing. Sweet. This is all available in the terminal. I didn't know half of this was available until I started reading through the Spectre console docs, which is why I've been looking at it, and it's really cool to play with.
You don't have to really play with the ANSI stuff at all either.
So I did all my own ANSI codes for a long time before realizing, yeah, I could have just offloaded it to Patrick Svensson. I think that might be his last name, who wrote Spectre console. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because it's all .NET, it integrates kind of well. But I think if you look at something like this, what I did, read Spectre multi-selection, doing it directly is quite a bit of work. So git command, that one. See what it looks like. Oh, that's pretty hard. I think I've done this before. Write code block. So it does a lot of work. Like there's actually quite a bit of setup, and because the stuff's all using classes inside .NET, you got to remember all of these things, and you're passing objects around. And there's also things like extension methods, which are kind of a bit fiddly to play with. I don't think there are any in here, but yeah, extension methods and typed parameters become a bit hard when you're trying to deal with it. And I just want to provide a list of things to select, or a list of checkboxes. So yeah, if you can check that out. It's also got this thing, Start Spectre Demo, which I don't have time to run through, but it has all of the different bits and pieces of it. So it'll take you through all of the different functionality and the examples. I haven't written much documentation in lieu of it. I did this, and it shows you how all these things can happen. So if you're curious, give it a crack. It can do graphs. It can do spinners. I have to wait for this one now because I can't skip it. It also does a different style of loading bar, and you might think, well, we've got write progress. but does write progress easily do parallel jobs? No, you have to muck around with synchronous hash tables and whatnot. So this can do a little bit of stuff like that. Got to try get past this one so I can carry on. Good question though, Doug. I did forget to put anything about Spectre Console in this demo. It can also draw pictures. Right. I'd have to go back to where I was at to know what I was just talking about. I was talking about SSM Connect. So I was talking about the new approaches I'm taking to writing interactive PowerShell scripts, things which can prompt a user for information. Talked a little bit as well about Spectre Console and how that can interact with PowerShell. If anyone's got any time, I'd love ideas on that and opinions, because I've just kind of made it up as I went and don't know what people actually need. So check it out. One of these other cool experiments I've been having to play with is from Stephen Butcher. I hope I said his last name right. He's from Microsoft, and he's recently blogged about feedback providers in PowerShell. And I'll give you a quick run of what these things do. So I think it's going to make PowerShell a lot more approachable for newer people if we can take advantage of it and build some really good feedback in. They look cool. They have definitely got potential, but I don't know how to work with them at the moment without ruining the terminal UX, because I've been making them run really slowly, which apparently is not a way to go, because these things would be used in your suggestions and your command line as well. And at the moment, holding it up for 5 minutes while I talk to ChatGPT isn't really a way that works. But if we want to look at feedback providers, I'm running the latest PowerShell preview, and we can do some stuff like get child item, but I've spelled it wrong. So the default feedback provider they have in preview at the moment is this one. So it tells you, oh, hey, you probably want this, which is really handy. It does a lot for people who spell things incorrectly or forget the hyphen probably when they're writing a command name, which is great. But I thought, what can we do about this to make it a little different? We've got a few feedback providers here. We've got one called commandlet params. So this one here, I'll give you a look at the code afterwards, but it's something like get child item, where we have a command and we've spelled an argument wrong. This happens a lot, especially when I'm doing something like I'll copy some instructions and I've got different versions of the module. And in this case, it would go through and look for similar command arguments in the PowerShell code and say, hey, oh yeah, you're trying to use PTH, you probably want one of these. So it's found things with a similar letter count. Another feedback provider I've got, before I go on to the PowerShell AI one, which Doug probably wants to see, is module finding. So, oops, oh yeah. These ones are slow, so you have to use a dodgy version of PowerShell that I've modified. I've opened a pull request with the PowerShell team for this, but it's sitting in limbo at the moment. It increases the amount of timeout you can have for these feedback providers. So if I do the module finding pre-feedback provider, and we do something like we had before, convert from YAML, I don't have that installed. So it kind of just hangs up the terminal at the moment. This is the UX side, which I think needs to be improved. I don't know how you would do it, but I'm sure there's a solution. Because being able to provide people with information like this and say, hey, here are the modules you could be using, something like that would be kind of useful. These would link to, oops, I didn't click on it properly. Yeah, these would link to the PowerShell gallery and tell you, hey, that's where you can find them. So you can do your own research and read it and install it. But the module finding, that is something that I think has potential. The last one there is probably Doug's baby, PowerShell AI. This one's probably the slower one, but if we do a similar argument, if we go get child item path hello, this has gone off to ChatGPT and said, hey, I'm having troubles. What can I do about this? And it's gone and said, hey, based on that, you could correct the typo. You've probably spelled it PTH instead of path. So the correct command would be this. It's also offered up some other suggestions. Generally, I think the strongest one is first. But yeah, so this here would also require a bit extra time. I think it may be with the feedback provider stuff, it could potentially collect these and then collect the information. If it sees it again, provide you the feedback on the second run or something, so that it doesn't actually block your terminal, because it is a bit annoying sitting there waiting for it. But yeah, these feedback providers, how do they work at the moment?
Personally,
I did not read
I have
the
to say thank you.
instructions.
Thanks for going through that, because I was going to go do it, and I'm glad you did.
Yeah, you would have learned the same mistake as me probably. I don't know if you can see at the top of the screen here, but it says you're not supposed to write these in PowerShell. I just immediately looked at it and was like, well, I can write almost anything that you can do in C#, you can do in PowerShell. So I just went in and started doing it. And then I asked Steve Lee from Microsoft, and he said, no, it's not supported yet. There's a few threading issues. So these feedback are proof of concept, but they have a few issues that are unresolvable at the moment. So you would have to write these in C#, but for right now, I can write them like this. So I'll try to get rid of all the stuff in here that you don't actually need to worry about. We're using a couple of namespaces. Somehow I've gotten lost in them. Get rid of those. This is a parameter for me to help. This is me reminding myself that I'm in the wrong version of PowerShell. And so we have like some basic information we have to provide. We have to give it a GUID so that it's uniquely identifiable. We need a feedback trigger, which for this one is error. So you can trigger on different types of feedback. I can say, I want to register for any errors that occur. I want to register for, I think, commands not found. I want to register for comments. So if someone writes a comment in, you can react to that. There's a few other ones as well. I think there's also all. So this is an experimental phase at the moment. And it's probably because if you had it on all handling and you had a bunch of these feedback providers, it's probably going to cause a bit of chaos, but it's good fun. I added this extra function here, timeout milliseconds. So I had it so that as a feedback provider, you can say, hey, I'm going to take longer, and PowerShell won't give up on you because it gives up after, I think, 300 milliseconds, which for ChatGPT, just not quick enough. You give it a name. I gave this one PowerShell AI, and a description so that when you look in the list of registered feedback providers, it tells you what it's supposed to be. The gist of the feedback section, you get given 2 bits of context. You have to implement get feedback, the function. You get given a feedback context, which is the object which has information about the command that occurred, and a cancellation token, which I've completely ignored, but you're probably supposed to actually cancel all tasks if that gets cancelled. There's a check here for some run space stuff. I don't know if I required that. I copied it from the example. And then we've got my ChatGPT part. So this thing is just saying, running some commands from Doug's module, saying stop chat. It's giving it a bit of information saying you're a PowerShell expert and you provide concise options as a list to work around a problem when given an example. It says here, what can I do about this command? It grabs the command that failed from the command line, and it also gives it the error message. Right now, super experimental. Probably wouldn't want to use this because it might pass your passwords up, but it's good fun to play with. So I've been tinkering. It then uses get GPT-4 completion to ask ChatGPT-4 what to do. And then if it can't get any errors, can't get any information, it's just throwing a warning. The suggestions here is just a list of strings which you're returning. I'm going to scroll further. You generate your list of strings. I'm just going to skip over this bit because it's just quite a bit of code because I was pulling things out. I'm using regex to get the stuff out of the ChatGPT response. And then I'm limiting myself to 5 points. And so I'm just stopping once I hit 5. So with those, we feed the suggestions into this feedback item, and then we return that. So the gist of it being, you get rid of all that and get rid of all this stuff. This is all just me mucking around at the bottom. The feedback provider is really just this. It's a GUID, it's a trigger, it's a name, and then you're given a piece of context, and then you return a feedback item. So the basics of it is not too complicated. What you can do inside of it is up to you. But I think these things have a lot of legs. I think it's going to be really handy. And I don't know how they're going to go in the future, but it is pretty cool. I can imagine in the future maybe a Microsoft Clippy that pops up and provides you asynchronous feedback without blocking your terminal. Hey, I noticed you've been trying to use this. Did you think you can do that? That would be cool. Sorry, I have to quit Vim now, maybe sometime. There we go. So that's how the feedback providers work. It's something that I'm real excited about. I'm going to play with. I don't know if I think there's been a PowerShell community meeting today that they did some more demos and we're talking about them. I haven't really looked at the roadmap. People in the US are on a different time zone to me, so you have all your exciting stuff while I'm asleep, sorry. So that's feedback providers. And I think this is last on my interactions. PowerShell AI like I said, I actually wanted to create my own ChatGPT PowerShell module. And then I started doing it. And then I realized I had a look around and found Doug's, and he'd done all the legwork. So I didn't have to do all the boring stuff dealing with the API commands and arguments. So I decided I'd switch tack and just provide some inputs to his. And then I worked on something called the PowerShell AI function builder, which was my first attempt at using AI to generate PowerShell code. I figure that if someone like yourself can nudge it in the right direction, it can do a whole lot more than what you can do when you're just talking to ChatGPT in the window on the web, because that is purely large language model. Until recently, when they had code interpreter, it was just text, and it was just dealing with it as if you were writing a book. And it would screw things up. It would hallucinate function names. It would hallucinate parameters. And it was really good, but it had some parts which meant I just couldn't rely on it all the time.
Hey,
So I built the function
you just
builder.
brought up the point about hallucinating. You see my new T-shirt?
It's blurred out like it's offensive. Oh, there we go. I hallucinate more than ChatGPT.
So
I want whatever
I
you're
don't know if
on.
anybody thinks that's funny, but I thought it was funny. That's why I bought it. But continue.
Yeah, so I built the function builder as a first attempt at trying to make something build correct PowerShell code. What it basically does is you give it some information about what you want to build. It goes off and generates the code. It brings it back and it uses the script analyzer to first off work out if it's correct. And if it's not, it's going to fire it back to ChatGPT without you being involved and say, hey, you screwed this up. And then once it passes the script analyzer rules, it goes through some extra rules. So it goes through it kind of bullies the LLM into thinking about always using parameter names, because there's a lot of times you would say just like get child item and you give it a string. But when you start asking it to do a lot of stuff, it'll make parameter names up, or it'll just provide first parameter and it won't match the type it's expecting. So by telling the ChatGPT to say, hey, always use those parameter names, it seems to get a bit more context around what it's doing, and it provides more valuable feedback. I have a video on YouTube about that if you want to check it out, but it's a bit of a yarn. It will go forever. So I'm going to jump on to the next bit, which is...
well, before you do that, of course, I have to add my 2 cents. But
okay, go with your 2 cents, Doug.
So here comes the 2 cents. Is that what you use down in New Zealand?
I'm going to upset you with my next bit anyway. I've gone off the beaten path of PowerShell AI and I haven't demoed this to you.
So yeah, some of the new features out of OpenAI even today is that what Shaun has built is actually a precursor to some stuff that they've actually delivered, which is what's the challenging part about building these kind of modules against ChatGPT, because they constantly improve it. Then all of a sudden, the stuff that you did, they just kind of like obliterate, because it's like, okay, now they have function calling, now they have the code interpreter, all that kind of stuff. So the good news is that ChatGPT and OpenAI are getting much, much better. But with Shaun blazing the trail, it's like, oh, okay, this is how we're going to have to interact with it going down the road. And that's just to the point, there's like something out there called Baby AGI for artificial general intelligence, where you can actually build workflows with ChatGPT, so it can do what Shaun's saying. And then rather you interacting with it and it can say, hey, go and check and see if these things these functions have those parameters. Oh, they don't? Okay, let's go fix that. And then, he and I have actually talked about doing sandboxing and all that kind of stuff and using Docker, which in fact how the code interpreter works with Kubernetes and Docker. And I can go on for an hour, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, it would be pretty cool if PowerShell AI had a code interpreter, Doug.
Working on it.
Working on it. So am I. I might beat you to the market though. I got one right here.
Exactly.
So I've been working on the next step of what I think the function builder should have been doing, which was actually being more strategic about how it's generating the code. And here I've got an example of something I've called the AI code interpreter. It's in my presentation repo. I haven't pushed the branch, I think, to PowerShell AI because I have been doing all the stuff for the presentation in one big folder, because I did so much weird things that I needed to effectively fork all the modules I was dealing with. So this here is going to give us hopefully a demo of the type of thing I'm trying to do. This here is a code interpreter similar to the Python one that ChatGPT have, but it's PowerShell specific. So I've given it some basic instructions. There's a system prompt behind the scenes that says you're a PowerShell code interpreter or something. You write tests, you write code, and you make sure the tests are passing, and you also make sure your code is actually doing what I originally said in the prompt. That's the gist of it. But I also gave it a couple of functions because I wanted to give it some more power to be able to make decisions. And the first thing I did with Code Interpreter, with the Python one, was I just asked it some math stuff and said, hey, can you do some mathematics with Python? And it's got NumPy, it's got all this stuff. And I was like, cool, that's really neat. But how would that work in PowerShell? So for this, I created just one basic function actually called get math calculation or something. I tell ChatGPT about that. So I say, hey, I'm going to ask you a question, and here's the functions that you can use also to help solve it. So for here, I've said take a number and return another one. Pretty simple. Given a number parameter of 140, the function returns 61575. And given a number of 10, the function returns 314. I've given it a little bit of a hint there. 314 is very similar to pi, so hopefully it can work this thing out. But I've had really poor experiences demoing ChatGPT, so I've actually cached the responses of at least one of the runs that went okay. So just bear in mind, it doesn't usually go like this. It's usually a bit worse. So if we kick this off, it says here it's cached because it's pulling it from my local cache ChatGPT responses. Saves me a few dollars on my bill as well. And it's come back with a response. So it's based on the requirements, we need to write a function that takes a parameter and returns another one. The function will return, I can't read under my terminal, 61575 when the input is 140 and 314 when the input is 10. So first let's write the pester test. And you can see here, it's written a real basic pester test. So that's the unit test for PowerShell. It says, based on those inputs we had, it's expecting an output. It could go a lot further with this, but right now, I wrote this over the last week or so, so it's pretty rough. I also told it, if you need any help because you don't know what you're doing, just yell out for help. So it's actually said here, help at the end, and I didn't expect it to ask on the first response, so I've just ignored it. This last piece here is it's actually asking to run that function. It would be nice. ChatGPT on the web just blindly executes everything because, like Doug said, it's in a Docker container. But right now I'm running this interactively, and my sandbox is this folder here. So I don't actually want to just blindly execute code on my work machine. So if we hit enter, we're going to get the response. And the way the function builders work is that that response there actually gets fired back up to ChatGPT as a response message. It sees what it was assuming, and then it can use that as more information for the rest of its solution. So it's worked out the result of the calculation is approximately this number, 439.82, but it doesn't seem to help us find a direct relationship between them. So it's gone off and it started to do some other string math, and it's come up with this here. So it's come up with a demo function called number times 3.14, which is not too bad. And then when it's run the pester test, it's returned 61575. It expected that, but it got 61544. It's been fed back the results of the pester test as XML, and then it's gone through to work out from there what it could do to fix the code to make it sure it's passing. I've tried to nudge it to not correct the tests because I have found that when I was first doing this, it would be like, oh, your tests are wrong, and it would fix them by making it match the wrong result. So it goes through here and it's saying it's failed because the function returned a different number than it was expecting. And it's suspecting that its math relationship isn't entirely correct. It's then figured out that it actually needs to just be more accurate in the constant it's using. So it's actually gone down and figured out 3.14159, just a whole lot closer to pi. And then it's given me the new function. The pester tests have run again, but they're still failing. It expected 51575, but it got a decimal. So it got 51575.164. From here, it's able to make an assumption and go, okay, the test failed because it returned a decimal number, but they're expecting an integer. So now it's gone through and it's worked out from there that it can use the math functions, and it's updated it to say, do my number squared times 3.14159. Pump it through math round, and then the test should pass. And at this point, I was pretty happy to see at least one run generate something I was kind of expecting. I was hoping it would use the math pi constant, but it didn't quite get there. But then it goes at the end of it and says, hey, are you actually doing what I originally said in the prompt? Which for me, I said, given these numbers, please return a result. And I think I also nudged it and said, don't just use a case statement to match my inputs. So it's come through and it's done a bit of work. If I was to run it again, it's probably going to not go as well. I can probably say cached false. And now we're going with a live run. So this is probably going to go a lot poorer, but this here is using ChatGPT-4. And like Doug said, they're moving so fast that sometimes you'll run something one day and the next day it looks completely different. So this one here, I don't know how it's going to go. Also not the fastest API in the world, GPT-4. It's come up with a similar response. And it's asking to multiply a couple of numbers together. It's got the same result.
Gotta love live demos.
Yeah, that's why I did cache one, because I knew it would come up with something wacky. So you can see here it's done math pow, math pi, and squared. So it's actually, it's kind of where I was going, but it's got the function wrong completely. Expected 61575, but it got 1381. So now it's gone through and reasoned about it, come up with something else, and it's got your number squared times math pi instead of math pi squared, which was wrong. And now it's gotten closer. So it's got 61575, but it's received a decimal. So hopefully, it's asking me to run a function again. It just wants to know something about this number. Don't know why. I can't understand sometimes why it asks to run the math functions. I think it loves to show off that it can do them. So it's asked for the answer to the 140 by 140 by 3.14159.
So this is just basically you, your code, sending stuff up to ChatGPT. The top part is what it's thinking about, where it provides the function, and then it actually runs the code so that it actually then feeds that back into the overall loop.
Yep. So it is just a loop that just keeps going until it's correct, or your ChatGPT budget hits the ceiling, which it did for me originally. There's also, I had like a YOLO mode. I didn't realize that you could use.
What was your budget at? $5?
Oh, like $20. Yeah. No, I ran this a lot, Doug. I didn't know you could use an emoji as a flag, but I added the fire emoji so that I could just run through.
So maybe to just bore people who, if they're bored looking at all this stuff, what's really cool is this is, if you're up on ChatGPT, if you do pay the $20 a month and you use the code interpreter, ChatGPT does all this way faster with the code interpreter, and it's all Python, and it does exactly what this is. You can ask it things, it'll run it, it'll check and see if the output is correct. If not, it'll say, hey, sorry, I made a mistake. I think it's this. I'm going to go back and make a correction. And it does all this on its own, and it's way faster than GPT-4. We think it's GPT-4 4.5 just before they're going to go to GPT-5, but that's a whole different discussion. So this is a really great precursor. And again, the one in ChatGPT on the web, it's all Python at this point, which I'm sure they have plug and play for other languages, and we'll have to wait and see. But this is exactly the flow, and then Shaun has built that.
Yeah, so I did make this other one here, the little flame emoji command line switch, which it would actually just execute all the code as it came through. I think it's gone and missed the cache because I turned the caching off actually. But yeah, so I did have it executing the code immediately, but I realized that it was pretty dangerous, so I disabled it. So yeah, I'm looking into this because I think that the AI stuff is making everything a whole lot easier. I work with like a few people on my team who spend most of their day with ChatGPT on one monitor, and that's totally cool because like previously I was copy pasting off Stack Overflow and that stuff was always wrong as well. And you're still learning every time you do something. So you're not just blindly executing whatever the AI overlord tells you to do. You still got to use your brain. That's a very, very powerful tool. And if we manage to integrate it well with PowerShell, it's going to make it significantly easier to work with than alternatives like Bash. And hopefully it makes it more approachable for other people. Zoom. And that one went on for a bit longer than I expected, but it's cool. So now we're on to the last section anyway. So I lied. I said I didn't have time to animate a Pokemon game. I did actually struggle to get to sleep some nights this week because I was stuck for ideas, and then I got distracted building this so I could walk a person around my terminal. The gym in Pokemon is where you face your final challenge. And for me, it's going to be the PowerShell hero. I wonder what they got. Say hello, Shaun. So you think you know some PowerShell. How about you face my top 3 challenges? At this point, I'm pretty confident I know what I'm doing, but there's a few things which still bite me, and I see it bite other people too. So we'll see what they got. My first challenge is to properly use arrays. I don't know what the definition of properly is, but I know I've screwed these up so many times. So we jump into it. What are we supposed to be doing? We're just trying to use arrays. And if we look at what we've got here, we've got an array of users. So that's easy to work with. We've got users. Oops. And we've got 3 of them. So we're off to a good start. And we're trying to build a group. So we've created an object called group. Here's my enter key. We've created an object called group with the name admins and with an empty members array. So if we look at the group now, I like to use convert to JSON just to visualize it. We've got admins with no members, which is cool. And now we're supposed to be assigning our admins based on some pretty loose administration policies by the looks. Anyone that doesn't have an A in their name is going to be admins. So if we go now, we've got our group members, which is an array. We're setting it to a filter. So we've got all of our users and we're using where object to find all the ones that don't have A in the name. So now we've set up our group. If we take a look at this again though, and convert it to JSON, we'll find if we were to now send this through to some REST API that was expecting the group members to be an array, it's going to fall over. So for now, for PowerShell, it kind of works until they start looping over something and realizing you're getting each letter of the word instead of each word you were expecting. But now we can see here Jenny is a member, but there's no square brackets, so we're in trouble. So if we go back and we think about this, what does it actually work at all? How would you do it? So I've heard a lot. I read that there's this comma thing you can use. Sometimes I go, yeah, all right, I'm going to use the comma. That'll work. And if I take a look again, yeah, we're in business. Jenny's wrapped in an array now. We're good to go. But we're going to check that it works for other alternative solutions. So maybe what's another rule we could have? Well, we could just invert this. So we want to find all the people with A in their name. And now if we look at the group members again, we screwed it up. So now we've got an array of arrays with one array inside the other. Again, same thing's going to happen, going to fire this off to an API, it's going to get upset. And now I come to the conclusion of reading a few more pages on Stack Overflow and realize I can just wrap it in an array this way. So we put an array outside of it, which doesn't quite make sense in my head. And then it's collapsed itself. And so when we look at it, we've got Shaun and Oak in there. And if we were to do the other one, which was named not like A, we should also have hopefully an array as well. So cool. I figured out this array functions thing, but array collapsing and expanding and whatnot still boggles my mind all the time. And if you've noticed, I've done a lot of these pictures on the screen, which requires a lot of X and Y coordinates and basically a big square to position them. And so when I first started doing it and I was trying to put my arrays in arrays, it would look a little something like this, like screen equals an array. And then I'd have my first row. And then I'd have my second row of pixels. And so I'd have 1, 2, 3. And then I'd have a second one, 4. Nope, that's not a 4. 5, 6. Now when we look at screen and we want to grab the first top left pixel, we go, all right. But it's actually one big list. Oh no, it's actually worked correctly this time. Oh, is it because I used the comma? Yep, it is because I used the comma. Magic. All right, we'll do this the other way around. So this is the way I'd usually initialize an array. I'd create one, and then I would add my first row. Oops, plus equals. By appending my first row to it. And then I would be like, all right, now I want to append another array to it. So we'd do our 4, 5, 6. And now when I look at my screen, it looks the same, but there are 6 items in it. And this just array behavior trips me up all the time. So that's why I put it as my first challenge, because I still screw it up and I still keep having to refer to the documents. And I think I've been using commas when I shouldn't be, Doug. I don't know. I saw in PowerShell AI, you always wrap your arrays outside with another array to make sure they're the correct type.
All depends.
It all depends.
And the problem is I've been doing it for too many years, so I don't remember the reasons and why I do things. I just
which makes it very hard for new people.
It makes it impossible.
So that's one of the first challenges, and it's one of the things I find people struggling with. Although it's still better than arrays in Bash, so we'll just leave it at that. In the next one here, so the return types to functions. What have we got? Number 2 in the challenges I still face. It's just output. So the fact that anything that isn't redirected can come outside of the function starts to cause me pain. So in this case, if we do something like save current date, we get a date. That's cool. That's what we're expecting. If we put that in a variable, what's the date? It's the date. But there are things which can affect your function, which will impact the output. So for this, it's testing the path here as a log path. And if it doesn't exist, it creates an item. Sometimes you don't test your functions in all of their different permutations, and this bites you at a later date. You're like, oh, I'll just create this folder if it doesn't exist. And you don't realize that that's actually going to cause an issue. So where's my log path? It must already exist. We'll just remove it and hope we don't accidentally get this wrong. Recurse, course, remove item. I'll follow my own rules. Try not to use the aliases too much. Oh, remote item, can't spell. Now if we run get current date again, save current date, it's completely different. We have this datetime object, which again is now formatted differently. It's not the nice way because it's used a different formatter. And it's also given me the folder that it created during it. So this new item actually does output some information. We'll call it testing. And it comes out. So usually with this, you try just to assign it to something. You can assign it to a null variable. You can assign it to whatever you want. Whoops, that's an error. So that it doesn't pollute the function output. But sometimes you're not in control of all of these things because you're calling a commandlet, which is going to output something occasionally, and then you have problems. This is one of the challenges I still face. I kind of just wish these return statements did actually mean that's what's being returned, but it's just not the way it is. And I don't know what the reasoning behind the scenes was for that. I think for ease of use, I'm not sure.
That was my, I think, yeah, that was my thought. It was just ease of use, but yes, it introduces a lot of issues when you come from different languages like C#, etc. It's very confusing. Yeah. All of a sudden you have extra stuff in your output stream and it's like, what the heck happened?
Yep, which can be very, very confusing. I think we'll just start with that. So we've dealt with that. That's something we know about now. We just got to pump everything out to a variable in case it actually returns something. I think I've found functions before which will occasionally output a number if it has to allocate more memory. Otherwise, it'll just be silent. That's one that's pinged me. So got to keep an eye out for it. And lastly, the interop with native binaries. Being in platform engineering and having a team who's now dealing a lot with doing things like Git from PowerShell or calling other existing exes, the difference between Windows and Linux is something that's really painful. So the standard error output being used for debug messages on Linux, polluting the PowerShell terminal, it all shows up as big red errors inside like the build server, but they just silently cruise past. And for me, this is one I lost a good amount of time on. It's been fixed now, but it still will bite you if you haven't Googled it. So we got the Windows subsystem for Linux. And if we do something like list all the items in there, we'll see we've got 3. And I initially just wanted to see, I just wanted to grab the Docker desktop one and see if it was running. And I thought, yeah, it looks simple. It's just an output, right? Just chuck it in a variable, WSL out. And then we check what's in there. I never checked what was in there. I assumed it looked correct, but there's extra lines. So, okay, this looks a bit strange still. But we can deal with that. There's just extra new lines in there. So we'll go to line 1 is that. Line 1 is the actual line 2 is empty. So that means if we go down to line 4, we should have the Docker desktop data. Now, what I was trying to do was find Docker desktop data. So I used my basic PowerShell skills and I was like, yeah, right, we're just going to look for anything that looks like Docker. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. It's right there in front of me. I can read it. And I don't know why I spent so much time trying to fight this myself without Googling it. But yeah, WSL out was not encoding things correctly. So if we do something like, is it 2-car array? We'll see what's happening. Oh, maybe we'll do it a little less split over lines. Just put a comma between each of them. So we got Docker desktop, but there's empty characters between each of those O's. And this one honestly burnt so much time. I knew that there's something going wrong and then I couldn't figure out how to deal with it. And I don't know what I did in the end. I think I switched the encoding of the terminal backwards and forwards until I found something that actually worked. So inside everywhere I've called WSL, I'm flicking around encodings and have no idea how I solved the problem. In hindsight, I should have Googled a bit more because apparently there's a solution to this, just to tell WSL to behave itself. But for legacy purposes, it doesn't actually, oops, WSL out. For legacy purposes, it doesn't behave the way you'd expect it to. What was I doing there? Why did I have an array before? Oh, it's not got new lines. Yeah, it behaves completely differently. I haven't even tried this before. So if we grab number 4, it doesn't exist. 3, is it like Docker desktop? Now it's behaving. So I've figured out my problem. I've just got to make sure I remember to set these magic environment variables, WSL, UTF-8, anywhere I'm dealing with WSL. Okay, challenge solved. Surely it's not that hard to get to the end. I got one more native binary to deal with, and that's Git. I know that there's people that have written Git wrappers for PowerShell, and thank you very much, because that's probably the best way to do it. Don't try to fight the beast like I am. But for me, we're going to just go through and say, right, we're going to git checkout main. Oh no. I think I've got something. I've got something set up the wrong way. So we'll just clear that one again. All right, so git checkout main. It says a branch named main already exists. Generally, when I'm dealing with these native commands, I'll do something like this. So we'll just deal with it if it breaks. And I don't know, write a warning. Sorry, that's not good. But it doesn't happen. So there is another magic variable to think about. Last exit code, I think. I guess that shouldn't be 0 if we've done it correctly. If it doesn't equal 0, throw a problem. All right. And it says, sorry, that's not good. So we entered our exit section. I did notice though, when I was setting this up, I realized that there is probably a better way to do it. One of these new experimental features in PowerShell, which I didn't know about, was this PS native command error action preference, which is kind of what I've been wanting for a very long time. If a native command throws a non-zero exit code, I want it to actually be treated as an error in PowerShell. So it looks like this is what's supposed to be doing. So native command use error action preference. If it's set to true, it's going to believe whatever I put in error action preference. So we'll do that again. But we'll set this as true. Now, we probably, in theory, don't need this try. But it hasn't behaved the same. If we read this again, it's going to actually say, according to your error action preference. And I think mine might be set to continue. So we change this to stop so that errors actually cause terminating errors. In theory, we have the behavior that I've been wanting for years. So it's bloody brilliant, and this is going to make my life a whole lot easier. Things like if you've used kube control or the Docker exe or any of these things, you'll be able to actually capture those errors at the time they run. it is an experimental feature and it is coming, but it's something you can start thinking about today to make things easier. That was the last challenge, I think. There were only 3. So we're back here in the gym. And I'm being told I've been done well to get this far. I battled through. I've honestly dipped in and out of PowerShell for a very long time. Over the last 2 years, I've dipped in and stayed there, and I haven't regretted it. And if you do struggle through some of this stuff, you can be a PowerShell champion, apparently. I didn't know this was going to happen, but when my girlfriend asked me about something the other day, I was like, you know what? Imagine if you had to tell your friends, what does your partner do? And you said, he's an influencer. And they said, oh, what's his Instagram? Like, no, what's his GitHub? So that's where I'm at the moment. What have we run through? I actually put this conclusion on a piece of paper because I knew I'd get distracted, and I was surprised I got this far. I think in summary, we've got 3 main points that I've talked about and 3 main factors that we can do to convince more people to use PowerShell. We can work out solutions to anything that we've found intimidating in our past and try to come up with ways to avoid it for other people. Don't just assume that because you went through it, everyone else has to too. No one has to deal with that garbage. And we can also work with PowerShell to make it as interesting as possible. So stuff like the PowerShell Paint module I didn't expect it to get as much attention as it did, but it went to like the top of Hacker News and people were like, oh yeah, cool, PowerShell. I didn't know you could do that with that. Keeping things interesting and trying new stuff. Just throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks. People are interested, so it's always good to try. It's going to help people with interacting, and anything you can do to make it a whole lot easier is going to be great as well. And with the challenges, nothing's ever going to be perfect, but we do find today we're in a whole lot of a better space than when PowerShell only ran on Windows. At least that wasn't in my challenge section, because that used to be the thing where I did struggle. I spent a lot of time in Bash because it didn't make sense for me to invest my time in PowerShell because I spent so much time in other operating systems. So yeah, that's me. Thank you for listening. And all the stuff that I've got is on my GitHubs. There's like a 50% chance that this presentation will run on your machine. And I don't know. If you have any problems, hit me up with some issues. That's me today.
Awesome. Thank you. Any questions or comments that anybody want to give? Thank you, Shaun. This was great. I think AGI is going to solve all these problems, so I'm going to wait.
You're just going to wait, not write any more
I think
code.
about 2 more months and we'll be done. AGI will just take it all over. But that's
It'll be really good at Python.
It's going to be really good at all languages because, yeah, I don't know. We're going to see. There's a lot of rumors that are quite nice and percolating well, and with all the competition coming from Facebook and Meta and the other large language models, what they're putting out is really pushing the open AI people. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, but this is really great. Awesome.
Yes.
All right. I think with that, we'll wrap it up. Everybody, thanks for coming out, and keep an eye on. I'll post this later, as well as see what's coming up in the meetups, and we'll see you next time.
Right. Cheers, Doug, for having me along.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Sure.
Later.